What? You're still watching? We're on chapter 7, boys. Permissions management. I am surprised I have held your attention this long. Truly, you're either fascinated by Linux content or you have nothing to do with your lives. That's okay though. Life itself is meaningless, and we find meaning within ourselves and what we decide to spend our time doing. And if you wish to spend your precious life watching me go over Linux boxes, who am I to complain? I'm spending my life working on them and making videos. So let's talk about Linux permissions. That's the next step in our little journey here, right? If you're using a Linux system, first you need to know what Linux permissions are and how to modify them. First, let's start off with what they are. So let's talk about Linux file permissions. When you create a file on Linux, it assigns 3 owners to it. The first owner is, of course, the user. The second owner is the group. And then the third owner is your other, or everybody else on the system. So when you apply Linux permissions, it's going to apply ownership to one of those 3 groups. Ownership is set by default when a file is created. So the user creating the file becomes the default owner of that file, and that user's primary group also becomes the default owner of that file. So we've got our lab pulled up here. Let's practice making a file and see what happens with file permissions. So let's touch test file.txt, and then we echo test file.txt, so it has something in there, right? And then when we ls-l test file.txt, we see the permissions on the file we just created. The owner of the file is root. Remember, the creator of the file becomes the default owner, and the creator's primary group becomes the default group as well. So what happens when you're a user and you attempt to access a file? Well, the shell checks your permissions in 3 different ways. The first way is it checks if you're the user of the file, in which case it'll look at your user file and assign you the appropriate permissions for your user. The second is it checks if you have access to the file from your groups. So it'll look at your primary and secondary groups, and if you're part of one of those groups, assign that to your user and you have that equivalent level permission to your file. The third and final way is it checks if you're other, or if you're not part of those 2 groups, and then it assigns you default other permissions to those files. How do you check file permissions? Well, we've already gone over that. You use the ls command, or you use the ls-l to get a more informative output. Let's run an ls-al on all the files here. Haha, right, and you can see all the files inside of the root folder are currently owned by the root user and the root group, right? And you can see different permissions. So you can see read, write, execute. The ones that start with D are actually directories, and we'll dive deeper into that in further videos. Lots of useful information here. And you should get very comfy with this. You're going to be looking at a lot of files and a lot of file permissions when you're managing Linux systems. Everything is a file on Linux, so get used to managing them.